For the father, it was a walk in the snow in February 1984. For the son, it seems it was some skiing on the snow that convinced Justin Trudeau he could not hold out any longer. And in fact, the Prime Minister acknowledged yesterday it was the burgeoning calls from his caucus that ultimately convinced him it was time to go. What is Trudeau's legacy? And does his departure give the Liberals a chance to refresh the brand before the next election? Joining us on that, let's welcome Ontario's 25th Premier, Kathleen Wynne, who now teaches public policy at Victoria University and Trinity College at the University of Toronto. In the nation's capital, Tonda MacCharles, Parliamentary Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star, and Jeffrey Simpson, for more than 3 decades, a national affairs columnist with the Globe and Mail and author of 8 books. And it's great to have you, Premier, back here in our studio. It's great to see you again, and to our friends in Points Beyond, thank you again for joining us tonight on TVO. I want to start with the one of you who has basically had to give that speech before. So you know who I'm talking about here, Kathleen Wynne. The speech that essentially says, I really love this job, I would love to have kept doing it, but it looks like my time's up. How hard is it to give that speech?
Extremely. It's extremely hard. When you have loved the work, when you have believed in what you're doing, when you've been part of a team that has been doing that work, it's very, very hard. And, you know, the piece I wrote on the day that Justin Trudeau stepped down was about that he was having a rough day, you know, and we'll talk all about the issues surrounding that, and you know how long it took, and the weakness of the country, and responding to a team that was falling apart, all of that. But in that moment, when he had to sit down, and he talked about it in his speech, he had to sit down with his kids and tell them that he was stepping down. Those are hard human moments, you know, and yeah, my heart went out to him in that moment as a human being.
Jeffrey Simpson, let me take the ex-Premier's advice here and ask you whether he should have given that speech 6 months ago.
18 months ago, actually.
That far back?
Oh, sure. I mean, a couple of historical notes or comparative notes. One is, in a presidential system, there are term limits. So, you know, the Mexican president gets 6, the American president gets 8, the French president, so on. In our system, it's largely dependent upon the party itself. And the parties have extremely weak mechanisms for reviewing their leadership. So you get messy situations like the Conservatives getting rid of John Diefenbaker. That dragged on for a long time. You had, at the end of the Mulroney years, people saying, you know, it's time for you to go. But it's got to come that this internal incoherent pressure builds. And the leader almost always convinces herself or himself that if I just soldier on, if times get better, if the economy improves, if whatever, I can do it again. And it's very hard to look yourself in the mirror. Another point, look at history, okay? Ever since Mackenzie King, Canadians have given their governments about 8 or 9 years if they start with a majority. Sometimes it's 2 majorities, sometimes it's 1 majority and 2 minorities. If Trudeau had stuck around, he was asking the Canadian public to give him a 4th mandate, which has not been done since the time of Sir Wilfrid Laurier and Sir John A. Macdonald. So he was bucking history in a gross way. If he'd left 18 months ago, he would have come out of COVID, which by and large people thought they did quite well. I certainly did. And he could have left with 7.5 years of being prime minister and, you know, not have to deal with the force of history, which, as I just said, means that in the 8th or 9th year of a government, the worst thing a government can face is this notion that it's time for a change. And when time for a change takes hold, you're done.
Tonda MacCharles, I want to ask you this. He acknowledged, Justin Trudeau, in his farewell speech, that one of the reasons he was stepping down, I guess the main reason he was stepping down, was because his caucus wanted him to. He didn't say, I want to spend more time with my family. He didn't say, I've essentially achieved everything I got into public life to do. He acknowledged the elephant in that caucus room. And I wonder if that surprised you, because you don't hear that often.
No, it didn't surprise me, because I think it very much is the reason why he's leaving. I think that up until 3 weeks ago, he was still convinced that he was the best person not only to lead the Liberal Party, against Pierre Poilievre in the next election, but that he was the best person to lead the Canadian government into what is a coming battle with the U.S. Trump administration that will hit Canada very hard economically. And I think he believed that up until about 3 weeks ago, when he was trying to move the chairs around so that he could bring Mark Carney into the government as finance minister and allow Freeland some other role. He revealed yesterday, actually, for the first time to us publicly, that he had asked her to stay as deputy prime minister. Previously, Freeland's version was that he had only asked her to stay in some ill-defined role on the Canada-US file. But I think the real catalyst for what got us there yesterday was this absolute sort of inferno that erupted after Freeland resigned, with the bomb she lobbed at his leadership in doing so. When she said that they were utterly at odds over how to deal with Trump, how to deal with the economy, how to spend public finances. And that, I think, not only was a huge broadside to the government, to him personally, and to his leadership, it brought out of the woodwork caucus colleagues who up until that point had kind of only a few, if you'll remember, there's only about a dozen or so had actually spoken out up to that point, post the loss in Toronto St. Paul's. But suddenly, many more were willing to put their name to the calls for him to go, and in private, behind closed caucus doors, to see the Ontario, Atlantic, and Quebec caucuses, a majority, as far as we know, we don't know if it was, a unanimous call, but certainly a majority of those caucuses coming out against him made it impossible, and he realized this, to continue. So I don't think he described himself yesterday as a fighter and someone who doesn't back down from a fight. I think that he was willing to keep up those two big fights until that time. Yes, it had been hard. Yes, he successfully, or he thought maybe, quelled the previous caucus dissent after the by-election losses, but I think this was the catalyst that got us there.
Premier Wynne, I got to ask you, because I presume you've thought about this in the past. He's, why do we have a 50-50 cabinet? Because it's 2015. He's a guy who, made a lot of his chops in politics on being a feminist and giving women a chance that perhaps previous prime ministers didn't give them. And yet his worst confrontations as prime minister, Jody Wilson-Raybould, Jane Philpott, now Chrystia Freeland, are all with strong women. Mm-hmm. Help us get our heads around that. How do you understand that?
I don't think I can. I don't think I have any particular insight into that. I certainly don't have any insight into what happened with Chrystia Freeland. I have no idea why the Prime Minister or the people around him would think that they could have that conversation with her on Friday and expect her to deliver, unflappably on the Monday a fall economic statement that she didn't agree with. So I really don't have an explanation for that. I think that maybe there was an expectation that in all of those cases that they would just go along, that they were good soldiers, that they would carry on, and I don't know whether that had anything to do with them being women or not. I just don't know. But it's particularly problematic because of exactly what you said. That he made part of his reputation on this equitable view of the world, and putting Chrystia Freeland particularly in that position. That I agree with Tonda. That was the turning point. That made it impossible for the team to hang together.
Jeffrey, do you agree that?
I would just.
Oh yeah, sorry, Tonda, go ahead.
Well, could I just quickly on that point? I would just say that Justin Trudeau has actually got a very hard-nosed, ruthless political streak when it's called for, and he hasn't just dumped women. He dumped Bill Morneau when he was ineffective. He's dumped, for example, Randy Boissonnault when he became an embarrassment to the government. He was ruthless about ousting Liberal senators initially, way back when he first came into the leadership role of the party. And so he's shown a ruthless streak when it's called for, but he also, I think, thought that, and made a mistake perhaps, of thinking that those women would have been loyal team members, as Kathleen said. But I think, notably in the Wilson-Raybould Philpott cases, they were, I would say, not longtime Liberal Party activists, members, organizers, party members, MPs, then ministers. They came in from the outside of the Liberal Party politics and didn't perhaps behave the way maybe Liberal types thought they might have or should have. And in Freeland's case, at least she was an outsider until she became very much an insider to Justin Trudeau and a very trusted lieutenant. So I think she's the more interesting case. And does it tell us that he's not a feminist? I'm not convinced of that, actually, simply because of the other examples I've given you.
Jeffrey, you want to come in on this?
Well, he recruited hard, both the former Minister of Indigenous Affairs and Chrystia Freeland. I mean, They were not in the Liberal Party. He went out and got them, and to his credit, brought them into the Liberal Party. And unfortunately, they came a cropper. Hubris. It goes with being in politics too often. You don't know when the time has come. Now, you talk about these caucus members, okay? Those caucus members, God love them, in all parties, go home every weekend or when there's a parliamentary break, and they talk to their constituents and they hear from their constituents. And those Liberal MPs have been going home now for some months and getting pounded when they knock on doors because Trudeau was so unpopular and the party was becoming extremely unpopular, more and more so with every passing week. So they come to Ottawa this week or in the weeks before this, having heard this on the doorstep in Liberal ridings, not just in hardcore Conservative or NDP ridings. And they say, I'm done in the next election if I run. And some of them are already saying, I'm leaving. Okay. So it was the public opinion that pressed itself on those MPs. And they overcame the Prime Minister's hubristic view that somehow, in the face of overwhelming opposition in the country to him staying, and almost certain catastrophic defeat for the Liberal Party, that he somehow could, rescue the team. I mean, this was hubris of a kind that one sees from time to time, and it usually leads, as Shakespeare tells us, into tragedy.
I want to do something now that I actually have not seen a lot of coverage of, because so much of the coverage has focused on the Prime Minister overstaying his welcome, frankly, I guess is the way to put it. And that is, he thinks he's got a good story to tell. He thinks he's made some historic achievements during his 9 years in power. And Tonda, I think maybe with the exception of a piece that you wrote the other day, which did go through some of the victories he enjoyed over the years, we should spend a moment here saying we got, as a country, this because Justin Trudeau ran the government for the last 9 years and 2 months. Kathleen Wynne, what's on your list?
So on my list is putting in place a child care program that has been talked about for decades. On my list is changing fundamentally the conversation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And we can argue about whether those policies were successful and whether the expectations were met. I would suggest the expectations probably weren't met, but the path to reconciliation or the process of reconciliation has been advanced by the conversations, by the processes and the policies of this government in a way that I think we haven't seen before. I think there have been, there's been an expansion of healthcare in terms of dental and pharma, particularly pharma, which he advanced. I think that those are significant changes, and those things are going to be, I think, difficult to roll back. I don't think Pierre Poilievre is going to be able to undo the advances that were made on the Canada Child Benefit, for example.
You brought in a pharmacare program and Doug Ford canceled it in 10 seconds.
He didn't cancel it entirely, though. He modified it. So it's important, He modified it because all those young people in OHIP Plus who would have lost their free pharma those families would have reacted. So he didn't do that. He took it away from the people who didn't have a plan. Anyway, that's a technical detail. But he didn't repeal it. So you're kind of making my point that it's going to be hard for him to do. The Canada Child Benefit that's lifted hundreds of thousands of kids out of poverty. That's a significant. Now, it was an improvement on what Stephen Harper had done. So Stephen Harper brought it in. But those are significant changes that I think, in the history books will be attributed to Trudeau.
Jeffrey, is there anything on your list that we didn't just hear from Kathleen Wynne?
No, I think those social programs are the ones that he will be most remembered for and probably thanked by a lot of people thanked for. So I'm quite prepared to give him credit for that. He was a much more, and I use this word advisedly, a radical leader of the Liberal Party than people, I think, understand. What do I mean by that? I mean that the genius, and it was a genius, of the Liberal Party pre-Trudeau, including in his father's time, by the way, was to have a party and in Ottawa that was balanced between, let's call them social reformers and people who wanted to make progress in that area, and what you might loosely call business liberals. Okay, Pierre Trudeau had a whole bunch of those people: Donald S. MacDonald, John Turner, Barney Danson, Alistair Gillespie, Ron Bassford, names many people have forgotten, but that was the liberal wing, the business wing. And then he had the spenders, the Jean Marchands, and so on and so forth. And that prevailed all through the Chrétien years and the Paul Martin years. This prime minister had a cabinet with, by my count, 2 people with extensive private sector experience, and a whole bunch of people who were active on the social files. So that the wing of the Liberal Party that was there, and part of it from the time when it became a very important party back at the beginning of the last century, atrophied. And the result, I think, and this will be controversial, is that they were pursuing a series of policies, not necessarily those, but identity politics. They're very in vogue in the English Canadian universities and cultural world these days, but which have very little resonance with the ordinary people. What the great Keith Davey, the great Liberal organizer of the Pierre Trudeau period, used to call garden variety Canadians. They looked at these policies, including gender and indigeneity, and they said, well, where am I in this? We just saw this in the United States in a very extreme way. And we seem to think in Canada, or at least the Liberals did, that we would be immune in Canada for people feeling that they were being left out because of all this attention being paid to particularistic groups. Well, I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true. And I think the Liberals have paid a very substantial price as a result of those approaches, which, by the way, if you just look at the polls, they're not in the top 10. I can tell you that. They might be 13th, but they're not in the top 10.
Let me get Tonda MacCharles to weigh in on whether you think anything ought to be added to the list of accomplishments that we've heard so far.
Well, I would I would agree with everything Kathleen said. I would add perhaps a couple of things. Pensions are on public pensions are on a more solid footing. And I guess even while the carbon tax has become a point of friction across the board now, and while I expect we'll see a lot of Liberal leadership contenders distance themselves from the planned increases to the consumer carbon price, I think that the Liberal government has made a significant advancement in, I guess, making it table stakes for any party vying to become government to have a plan to deal with the environment. And here's why I say that, because the industrial emitters, the heavy polluting industries, do have a carbon price under this government that I have not heard one Conservative say should be ditched. And I expect that will have a lasting impact. It has staying power. And so let's put that on the positive side of the ledger. And to a certain extent, while this government never met 2% of the GDP target for defense spending, it has significantly increased defense spending in raw numbers. So I think, to expect that any Conservative government will come in and start dialing back those two aspects, defense spending and an industrial heavy polluting, heavy emitters sector, I don't think we should expect to see that. Now, on the negative side of the ledger, while Trudeau put forward a opened borders, Canada's a welcoming country to immigrants, brought in the Syrian refugees when he first got into power, they have stumbled badly on immigration levels, and they have lost they've lost the room on increasing numbers of temporary residents. So they've tried to dial that back. Immigration numbers and population growth didn't keep up pace with housing infrastructure and the ability to absorb that number of immigrants. So that's a negative side of the ledger. And I think that's a pretty significant factor in their downfall, and I think in public opinion. And I think going forward, it's gonna play a big role in both our political debate and policies going forward. So, yeah, and I think Kathleen's list is a pretty good list, and I'd just add those two.
Good. Less than 5 minutes to go here. I do want to put one thing to you, Kathleen Wynne, which I was kind of surprised when Mr. Trudeau made this revelation, I think, yesterday, when he said, the one regret I have is that I didn't get electoral reform through. He wanted to go to a more, ranked ballot system. He was insistent in his first term that first past the post, we were never going to have another election like that ever again. And he didn't do that one, and he let a lot of people for whom electoral reform is a big deal, he let a lot of them down. Could he, in hindsight, have just pushed through a system that he preferred?
Yeah, so I heard that as a bit of revisionist history, actually. I don't actually understand why, if he had really wanted to do that, he couldn't have. At the time, I remember thinking, well, why the heck don't you do a referendum the way we did in Ontario? We'd laid the groundwork. There'd been one in BC, so resurrect that process. So I didn't actually take that at face value. I think it's something that maybe he regrets now.
Well, he said he didn't have a second party in the House of Commons who would have backed it, and he didn't feel he could go unilaterally.
Yeah, but I don't think there was enough time taken to try to build any kind of consensus. That all happened very quickly after he was elected, and I remember at the time thinking, oh, okay, this is going to come back to bite you, and I think it did. So I just didn't take it at face value. I think there was a revision there.
Okay.
Remember, sorry, Steve.
Yes, Jeff, go ahead.
I was going to say, remember, there was no proposal put forward. It was that we were going to change the electoral system in a way that nobody knew. And there had been referendums on changing the electoral system. As Kathleen Wynne just noted, in British Columbia, it lost. And in Ontario, it lost. And Quebec was thinking about it, and then the government pulled back. So the experience in Canada at the provincial level had not been propitious for the federal government to succeed in a national effort, especially when they didn't have a particular proposal to put before the people. What they could have done was create a group of people, come up with a plan, put it before the country, and see what the country thinks. But the status quo in this country has always prevailed when put up against ideas for change.
Okay, minute and a half to go here, and I'm going to ask Tonda. You kept an eye on this guy, obviously, for probably more than everybody else here, because that's your job. What's the number one big takeaway, lesson learned from this first minister that whoever replaces him, regardless of what party it is, needs to understand?
I mean, that's a really tough question. I would say two things. There's a lesson to be learned about how Brian Mulroney managed his caucus, and many prime ministers say they learned it, but I don't think anyone learned it as well as he did. And he kept his caucus behind him to the very end until he plummeted in the polls and had to do his own walk. Justin Trudeau paid lip service to some of that. So caucus management is very important, not just to keeping, your enemies and your friends close, but to keeping an eye on the electorate and how responsive a government has to be. So if the knock against Trudeau is that he didn't listen to Canadians when they weren't able to, make their household budgets work, and they were feeling the pressure at the gas tanks and in the grocery store, and when they went for their mortgages or tried to pay rent. Those are real concerns that, like Jeffrey said, caucus members heard. But at some point, you have to hear it, not just from, through the eyes of the opposition lens. If your own people are telling you, and as we understand, his caucus has been pressing that issue. Justin Trudeau did a carve out for Atlantic Heating Oil, which became sort of a death knell for them because it undermined one of their key policies, the carbon pricing. But the caucus, there was another way to go at that to address affordability concerns. The caucus had been pressing for it. And so I think that's a takeaway for me. It comes, I think Trudeau would have benefited, his government would have benefited from listening more carefully to caucus, insulating yourself a little bit from your inner circle of close advisors in the PMO who tell you what is important, and equally from finance department officials who have their own version of what's important. It's a closer connection to the street, if you will, and to your constituency, and I think to policy making and decision making. So I would say that's the takeaway from me, that any future party leader, Pierre Poilievre included, has to kind of pay attention to. You know, caucus is not just, I mean, sure, there's a lot of people we never remember the names of, but there are a lot of people doing a lot of hard work and merit listening to.
The care and feeding of caucus, as they used to call it in Mr. Mulrooney's days. I want to thank Tonda MacCharles from the Toronto Star.
Sounds tried a bit, but...
Tonda MacCharles from the Toronto Star, Jeffrey Simpson, so many years at the Globe and Mail, Kathleen Wynne, 25th Premier of Ontario. Kathleen and Jeffrey, I'm going to ask you to hang around. We got one more segment for you. Thanks so much to everybody. Appreciate it.
Thanks all.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.